When friend of the podcast, Devorah Heitner, introduced me to Phyllis Fagell, today's guest, earlier this summer, I was so excited. Phyllis works with parents and families as a licensed clinical health counselor, certified professional school counselor, a journalist who's written for, among many other publications, The Washington Post, and she's the author of Middle School Matters, which is a book about how parents can help kids navigate early adolescence. And I'm excited to bring Phyllis on the show because from where you're sitting, early adolescence might seem something of a mystery. My master's degree in early childhood education qualifies me to teach grade 3 and under. That's about age 9 and below. So when my first child turned 10, I did not know what to do. He's 20 now and his younger brother is 16. And I've discovered that middle school, contrary to being afraid of kids hitting that age, can actually be a really great time to be a parent. And I am super glad to bring you the wisdom of today's guest to help in that department. Phyllis helps kids and parents navigate the many pitfalls and worries of early adolescence, and she's got so much hope and joy about this age to share. So, ladies and gentlemen, please welcome today's guest, Phyllis Fagell. Welcome, Phyllis.
Thank you for having me.
Hey, I'm so glad you're here. We're recording in August, and this conversation my plan is that it will be out in September. And I'm wondering how you and your family are doing in August of 2020. In the pandemic?
Wow, that is such a loaded question in a lot of ways.
I don't mean it to be so.
No, and I actually don't say that with a tinge of negativity. We're actually, I think, all things considered, doing really well. I think, if anything, the last 6 months has prepared us for a fall that is just drenched in ambiguity and uncertainty. If you asked me a week ago, I would have told you I thought I was returning to be a full-time face-to-face counselor in the K-8 school where I work, and that my son would be doing a normal college experience, my oldest, and that my 7th grader would be doing a hybrid. And anyone who now, thinking back on August, can recall things were changing every few minutes. And so at this point, my youngest will be all virtual. I'm working virtually. My oldest still thinks he's going to college, but it will be virtual classes from his dorm room. And then I have a rising high school senior who is also anticipating a year that doesn't look like your typical senior year of high school.
Wow. And I mean, we're in a similar situation in that but a little bit reversed actually. So our oldest he learned back in, I think, June, that his college was going to be virtual. And at the time it was a huge hit, but he knows now there's a certainty about it. He can plan his year, you know what I mean? And that's good. And it won't be from his dorm, it'll be from home. So.
Yes. And I think the ambiguity for many people is harder than having certainty that is not necessarily what they had hoped for.
And then it reverses, exactly.
Yeah,
exactly. And so our younger son goes to it's an alternative to high school. It's a self-directed learning center, and it's nice and small. And they have a plan so we live in Massachusetts where things have been quite calm over the summer. There's some concerns about slight rises in the the coronavirus cases. But as of right now, the plan is that in just about a month, he will start in like a non-virtual way, which is so funny to even think of it that way. So yeah, and they're hoping that they can get at least some time, at least a couple of months maybe before if things need to change back,
What town is that in Massachusetts?
We live in Bellingham, and his school is in Dedham. So
Sure.
Closer to Boston, and
Yes.
And we're just so glad and actually, we're so glad to have the way that they handled the whole thing has been amazing. They basically, I think like a lot of teachers, they looked on it as, this is a learning experience for us. We need to learn how to do things. And actually, one of my questions for you, you talk about on your blog at phyllisfagell.com, a kid wandering into your office one day and grabbing a handful of pretzels. And, nosing through some books, and you're sort of having this conversation with him, and you sort of realized that like the point, the reason he sort of said to himself, hey, I'm going to go get some pretzels, right? It wasn't, I'm going to go ask Mrs. Fagell a question. It was, right?
Yeah, that was the big epiphany for me at the beginning of distance learning. I always thought that I roped them in with the pretzels and then had an opportunity to talk to them, when in actuality, the pretzels were the excuse they used to come see me, which made it very difficult at the beginning of the remote learning to figure out how to connect with kids without those pretzels, without that natural segue for them. It's hard for kids. And when I talk about tweens, I'm really almost talking about kids as young as 9, certainly 10-year-olds, but kids who are on the cusp of adolescence. Some of them are really still very childlike and eager to just come in and unload and talk to you. And some of them really need some kind of emotional distance and some kind of an excuse before they'll open up. And the pretzels really did the trick in ways I didn't realize until we went remote.
And you do something really smart with that in the pandemic. Can you talk a little bit about, like, how did you get kids to want to meet with you
You
virtually?
know, one of the things that I discovered, and this was true and I'm in the K through 8, so this was true for kindergartners and it was true for 8th graders. They would come to share things about their personal life that were not that personal. So they would show me their pets or their favorite toys, or they would come for lunch and we would do icebreakers and get to know you games, or I would do a read aloud with some of the younger kids. But it took a little bit of time I had to actually tell them I was lonely and that I missed them and I needed them to come support me because I was sitting in these Zoom rooms all by myself. I needed to give them that excuse. Once they got there, the pretense often was just those very superficial connecting through their pets. But that, I'm realizing in retrospect, wasn't as superficial as it seemed at the time. That really was them sharing who they were. That was them inviting me into their home, quite literally in that situation. But it wasn't even disingenuous. I really did need them. I really did want their company and a chance to
Yeah.
see them. We were really worried as educators about how kids were doing. But it was fascinating to me that I couldn't ask them if they had an issue and wanted to come talk. I had to tell them I needed them. And then they were great, so responsive. Kids are they're so big-hearted and altruistic.
Yeah. Yeah. And if you give them that reason, it makes them feel needed, I think, right?
Absolutely.
It's reminding me earlier on in the pandemic as well, one of my kids, his teacher, we happened to be in a parent meeting. And so we were saying, how are you? And his teacher was saying, I feel like I'm talking to myself. Like I'm looking at a blank wall. I'm having such a hard time with this. And we were able to go to our son and say, listen, your teacher needs to see you. Like and our son had been, like so many kids of all ages, I'm hearing from clients and people that I work with as well, their kids, they want the video shut off. Like they don't want, if they feel any sort of badness or negativity, they and the younger you are, the harder it is to deal with. Right. And anyway, in this case, in my son's case, what happened was we could go to him and say, can we just get you a camera because your teacher needs to see you? And he was like, oh, of course. Like,
Oh,
and ever since he
sweet.
felt that responsibility, he really works hard. Like, I think when we're all of us in our own individual homes, it can feel so different and like we are so alone. And is your sense that, like, that helps kids not feel that way?
The whole concept of the video is fascinating to me. I write a lot about middle schoolers, and I definitely noticed that after about 10 minutes, they started to feel self-conscious. Or if they were having a bad hair day, that was a really legitimate reason they did not want that camera on. And of course, there are all kinds of equity concerns for kids who might not have a household that's calm, or there might be a mess or something happening that they're feeling self-conscious. And so I do think we need to give kids somewhat of a choice. But I love the way that you framed it to your child, because it gave them an opening and an opportunity to get outside of their own head. And I think that's one of the best ways to help kids right now, to help them transcend themselves and stop ruminating about what they lack or what their unmet expectations are, and instead really put themselves in someone else's shoes. And that reframe, I think, could be really powerful for a lot of kids who don't have any other reasons not to have somebody zooming into their room other than perhaps struggling with their attention span or
Mhm.
not wanting to be stared at.
Yeah. And I think as well, that's a huge challenge for teachers, isn't it? To to try and keep kids engaged, to try and I read, I actually clipped this article out of the paper, of a school system in Indiana where they outlawed pajamas for Zoom, basically, and I just couldn't believe it. Like, you have to be, and they said you can't be in your bed, or you can't be on your bed, and the parents are like, what are you, like, what are we supposed to, I've got 4 kids. How do I mean, like, there's so many, it just, like, why are you putting these restrictions? And one of the points that a parent made was, I watched my child do a lot of Zooms last spring, and there was no discernible difference between the kids wearing pajamas and their interactions and their engagement, and the kids who weren't. Like, why is this a thing? And I don't know what will happen with that. And then the other point that was brought up was, like, my child only has their bedroom to go where it's not a madhouse, because we are all living together. And it
Yes.
just, and I can see why a school, or a school board or a school district might want to do that. I just wonder if there are other ways to frame it or to engage,
Well, you're talking to somebody who's not a huge fan of dress codes in the first place, even in brick and mortar schools, simply because so often they're sexist.
Yeah.
And it's a school sexualizing attire that to that 10 or 11-year-old girl is anything but sexual. It's just comfortable. It's how they feel like they can learn best. And I think what you're talking about really relates to the whole concept of picking your battles as a parent too. We're talking about kids whose entire world has been upended. Their sports have been canceled. Their rites of passage have been canceled. Perhaps they have a parent who's been furloughed, or they're dealing with sickness in their family, or they're dealing with the repercussions of racism and police brutality. And are we really going to spend our energy worrying about whether or not the child is wearing pajama bottoms? It just seems like a misguided use of energy.
Yes. I 100% agree. I'm writing down your words. The title of this episode may end up being "Picking Your Battles as a Parent," because there's so much on everyone's plates and on everyone's minds. And I really got that sense from, so Phyllis, we were talking about this briefly before. You have been part of a wonderful it's called the Parenting in Place Masterclass. I've talked about it a lot on my show, because every week, I was learning things that I was then being able to say, like, so this is what I learned. This is what I've been able to incorporate.
Great.
And I did want to talk to you a little bit about that in any case, but I loved that you, everyone in that, like, here are these national experts in education, and the message that you're giving is, this is about how we as a family, how our child kind of is growing right now. And sometimes there's just not a place for, a standard curriculum, this isn't a time for sort of normal marching orders kind of time. In Massachusetts, we have homeschooled, and this is our 13th year of homeschooling. And one of my favorite things that I read in the case law for Massachusetts, regarding homeschoolers, is that the Supreme Court of Massachusetts upholds this idea that learning goes on, quote, outside the 4 corners of a textbook. And that's really the sense that I've gotten from the Parenting in Place Masterclass, is that so much else besides worksheets is learning. And I loved, you definitely contributed to that idea. And if you have anything else to say about it, I would love to hear it. And then there's something that I specifically wrote down that you shared in the masterclass that I wanted to ask you about. But I don't know if you wanted to talk a little bit more about, what I was just saying about, like.
I completely agree with you that this situation is, and I'm reflecting right now in my head on a conversation that I had with a student who said that they're really sick of the word unprecedented, and they're ready for some precedented situations. But this is unprecedented, and there are all of these embedded opportunities for learning that to the eye might not seem as obvious, but that might actually be more adaptive in terms of preparing kids for life than some of the content they otherwise might have acquired in the school setting. I know my oldest son learned how to cook. He was making us homemade pasta and all kinds of other foods. It was lovely while it lasted. He seems to have moved on to other pursuits at this point in time, but that will certainly serve him down the road. But there's also some of those more abstract skills, how do you sit with discomfort, or how do you soothe yourself when you just feel this sense of doom and gloom? Or are you able to pinpoint that you have that headache because you're spending too much time on a screen? Or are you able to recognize that maybe you're in a bad place emotionally because you were spending too much time scrolling through some grim news feeds, or perhaps spending time with friends who don't make you feel good about yourself, instead of really pruning and curating your social network to surround yourself with the kind of people who help you feel more joy when you need that kind of uplifting social network. And so I think those are all skills that are incredibly critical for kids, and that they might not have time to even think about. On the other hand, to be fair, I was on Facebook. I had written an article that came out today in the Post on helping kids socially and emotionally. And one of my childhood friends commented on it and said, when I was talking to my husband and we were saying, imagine being 15 and you have to spend 6 months at home. On the one hand, how awful, but on the other hand, it's this opportunity to really sit with your thoughts and really get to know yourself. And so I relayed that to my own teen. And I said, maybe that's a silver lining. You have this chance to sit with your thoughts and get to know yourself better. And his response was, no one needs this much time to think. So, it's a balance.
A good point. Yep.
It's a balance, but they are, no question, picking up skills that you can't get from any textbook or any classroom setting.
Yeah. And I confess some disappointment when I hear parents commenting, like somebody I heard saying, my kid had their work done like after an hour and a half, and they just had the whole afternoon to themselves. And they said that in a sort of negative way. And I was like, wait a minute, like that's a good thing. Like because in fact, what I saw in our, I have a private coaching practice. And what we were seeing in there was I generally am working with parents with toddlers, preschoolers, really early on elementary age. And what we're seeing is an uptick in tremendous mischief making. I mean, like there's just a lot more.
I love that.
Do you know what I mean? And it's like, so you're sort of hearing about one child's, week was she rigged up a way to use her scooter and be pulled by the dog, which of course is very not safe. And you don't want that to put the dog through that. On the other hand, so there was that. There was she found some caramels cooling on the counter, and she cut herself with a knife, which again, not good. But here's this child like, oh, I'm going to just use my ingenuity and sneak a piece of caramel, right? Kids just getting into things that they ordinarily wouldn't get into. So on the one hand, as a parent, what I would recommend is making sure that like we really have the bleach out of the way, and we really have we have strong locks on things we don't want them to get into. And on the other hand, try and let that be a thing where there is some independent time, where there's some open-ended non-screen, time, because there has never been a better time for it than this.
One of my favorite images that I saw during the first few months of the pandemic was a fellow school counselor who posted a picture of one of her own children had taken their Barbie doll and was using the Roomba as a taxi, the robot vacuum cleaner. So the Barbie was being transported all over the house on the back of this Roomba, which I thought was incredibly creative. Yeah. My own kid, and this is not limited to toddlers and really young kids, this mischief making of which you speak, but my own kid, there was one day I was in a Zoom class and suddenly I smelled something really acrid, like burning plastic. It was really bad. And I muted my screen for a second and I said, what is that smell? What am I smelling? And then a few minutes later, the fire alarm in my house went off and I said, why is the fire alarm going off? And I went running downstairs. And the next thing I said was, why is there a huge hole in the trash can? And I'm trying to piece this together. And suddenly my 11-year-old comes out and sheepishly says to me, next time I'm going to follow a recipe. And he had tried to make caramel, and he had burned it black. That was what I was smelling because it ended up burning the plastic handles on the pot it was in.
Yeah.
And then he panicked. And so he threw the hot burning caramel into the trash can, which was plastic, burned a hole right through it. Meanwhile, the smoke detector is going off. And I thought, this is just a day in the life of remote learning.
There's, we've been remembering a lot in our home is tragedy plus time equals comedy, which
I love that.
which applies in a lot of situations. So another mom whose 4-year-old came across hair clippers, like the not like scissors, but like buzzers, and gave himself a haircut and like shaved his head.
Did he do the eyebrows too?
I think the eyebrows are still intact.
That's
but
good.
It's like, I mean, things that we haven't had to think about in a long time, we're now having to think about, or at least we have had to think about them sort of since March. And
So true.
I mean, in a lot of cases, I feel like you just sit back and you just cross your arms and you go like, wow, that's impressive,
It really is. I remember there was I was doing a lot of read alouds with the younger grades. And there was one day where I decided I was going to be, quote unquote, helpful to the parents because I knew the kids were bored. I knew they were cooped up at home. And so I asked them, and I felt very good about this request. I asked them all to make the best fort that they could using whatever they could find in their house, and then to take a picture of it, and they could email me the picture. And what I realized shortly after that from the feedback from parents was that the next time I asked them to make me a fort, I should also make sure I included that I also needed them to clean up the fort when they were done. They had amassed every blanket in their entire house to make their fort, every couch cushion.
Oh my gosh. I'm working with one family who's basically all summer has been an extended, like, sleeping in the living room kind of deal where there's a tent basically permanently set up in the living room, and that's where they sleep like every night. And I'm sure, what we talk a lot about, right, is and I'm sure you do too, is just the idea of we are going to look back on this someday, and we're going to be like, man, remember that summer? And one of the things we'll remember is sleeping in the living room in a tent for like weeks.
Totally. I have a friend who has a very old boat. She lives on the coast, and their teen, who I think is 14, started sleeping on the boat. I mean, it was really the most creative way I had seen to date of a child actually getting some distance from their parents at an age when they really want to pull away. I know for my own kids, my teenagers, they're like vampires. They have the opposite hours as my husband and I keep. And I really fully believe, I fully believe this is the only way they can ever get any space and get the house to themselves. It's adaptive, actually.
Yeah. I mean, it really is. And so not so much Mischief, but one of our sons, I think in an effort to just get away from the screens, he's taken over our dining room table to play a game called Warhammer, which is like, it involves these little tiny figures, and he's setting up these huge, big, like sort of landscapes of it's a field of engagement, really. Wow. And when I went to bed at about 10 last night, and I'm sure he was up doing that. He's still asleep, and it's 1:40 in the afternoon. I think you're absolutely right. It's like it's an adaptive behavior. And what this really brings me into what I wanted to sort of talk about next, which is we parents, there's so much on our minds. There's so much that we are worrying about. And I guess my question for you is, when we are that worried, are we any more or less likely to sort of try to make our kids adapt our values or do something that we think they ought to be doing rather than doing what feels right for them? Does that make any sense?
Yes. And I think what you're talking about is, when is our anxiety productive, and when is our anxiety an impediment to our kids' emotional well-being? And I always recommend that parents ask themselves a couple of questions. Whose anxiety is this? Is this a real problem, or is this just something I've heard that my friends' kids are calling 14 friends a week and mine is only calling 3? And so therefore I'm going to bug him to call more friends because I think that is something he should be doing to ensure he develops social skills, when the kid could be absolutely fine. So that would be the whose anxiety is this question. And then the second is this something that I've said before? And if it is, then I'm 100% sure that the child heard what you had to say, I always return to Dr. Ken Ginsberg. He's a developmental pediatrician at Children's Hospital of Philadelphia. He's written a lot about resiliency, and his quote, and it's in my book because I just love it so much, is the greater the gap between who a child is and who they think you need them to be, the more they're going to struggle. And if there's one thing that we can do right now for our kids, there's not a lot we can do. We cannot shield them from discomfort. We cannot make their world perfect. We cannot make their sports teams play or their schools open. But what we can do is just honor them for who they are, and really let them know that we appreciate getting to know them for who they are, and that they make us laugh or they make us think. Whatever it is we can do to convey that we respect them and that we value their opinion and that there's something that they can teach us. And that's relating versus teaching. So what you are talking about is sharing our values or imposing our values. That's teaching. And parents, teachers, all of us, we do that probably 90% of the time. Relating is when they're the experts and when kids are teaching us something. And we want to make sure that we are not short shrifting the time we spend valuing what they bring to the table and making it clear that we value what they bring to the table, because that will help them stay centered.
Oh, I love that just so much. And it makes so much sense. And yet it is elusive. It can be really elusive for parents.
And right now, particularly because we are all whipped into a frenzy of anxiety. I spoke to one of the other psychologists actually in the Parenting in Place series, Catherine Steiner-Adair. She said the air is just drenched with this amorphous kind of grief. And she said, you ask someone, how are you? And there's this hesitancy. And I think that's something we're all aware of. And kids are just as aware of it as we are among one another. And the most protective thing we can actually do for our kids is to model sitting with that discomfort. Model that you can feel unsettled and you can feel disappointed, or you can feel real grief or a real sense of loss. And you can still look for what those moments of learning are within that grief, or what we might take away down the road from the experience.
I've been feeling a real sense of what I think of as cognitive dissonance in this, because it feels like the world ought to be one way and it's not, and I just on a related note, I got to interview a woman named Mariela Ortiz, who is a coach, and she's a coach for women specifically, not necessarily always parents, but she's currently doing a summit actually called Mommy Matters, and I was one of the guests, and I brought her onto my show, and I am one of her guests. But on my show during our conversation, she talked about how, and I think this is so true of what we were just saying, Phyllis, which is, imagine you come upon a friend and they have fallen in a hole. They're like down in the ground in a hole, and they're saying, hey, help, I'm down in this hole. I need your help. And you say, oh, and you go down into the hole with them, because that's what that's how you feel you ought to be doing. Right. And it's like, it's, instead of that, what we ought to be doing is saying, okay, I'm going to get help. I see someone right there. I'm calling to them. So we can feel like there is this, a kind of hesitancy when you're talking to someone of like, how are you? And I think it's completely understandable. But we can't all be in the hole together.
And that's a challenge. We all are being pummeled by the planet at the exact same time. I was reading this email that was sent from the dean of the college that my son is going to be attending, maybe, we'll see, in the fall.
Virtually or not,
or in person, virtually, who can keep track of all of these permutations.
Yes.
But I absolutely loved the message of the email she sent to my son. And what she told all of these rising freshmen, she recounted an anecdote. She had gone on a retreat. It was a meditation retreat, and she had been looking forward to it for years. And this was just a few years ago. We're talking about a grown adult. And she got to the retreat, and she was on her mat, and she was prepared for silence. And there was somebody else sitting near her, another woman who was super disruptive and who just would not be quiet. And no matter what she did to try to get this woman to pipe down, the woman just kept interfering with this moment of Zen that she had really looked forward to. And so she got up and she went to the person who was leading the retreat, the man, and she said, this woman over here, I've done what I can, but she's really ruining my experience. And she said the person running the retreat walked her back to her mat and said, Catherine, that was the dean's name, she is your experience. And the dean said, that just irritated me further. But now, and I sat down and I felt even more frustrated. And I thought, what am I going to take from this? And she said in this email to the students, I realized when I reflected later that he meant exactly what he said. She is my experience. My experience was how I learned to make peace with the fact that my expectations were unmet. And your college experience, it is not going to be the experience you envisioned, but you will learn how to make peace with things not going your way, and you will learn from this experience. And I thought that was super profound and helpful.
Yeah. And it does open up other possibilities.
Yes.
I think that's something. So just before we hit record, we were talking about, so Phyllis and I are just meeting today for the first time. And although Devora connected us a couple of months ago, we've been setting this up. And so Phyllis was like, what are we doing here? And I was sharing about my tendon disorder, which longtime listeners will know I've got this chronic illness that I don't think of it often as a chronic illness, but it takes place everywhere in my body. So it is where I develop scar tissue in times of stress. It's worse, and it can happen in overused tendons. And basically what happens is the scar tissue needs to be broken up, and that is a painful and awful process. But in learning to deal with this, I've learned to deal with so much. Like, not only have I learned to deal with so much, but I've learned to see that things that feel like tragedies or that feel like huge impediments can often be a great teacher. And I think this is exactly what you're speaking to, Phyllis, where it does open up possibilities.
Absolutely. And I love that story that you shared. And we were talking a little bit about how the main character in the story is not the hero, as kids often think, but the villain. And for you, the villain was the medical condition that you were living with. But from that villain, that's how you emerged as the hero, because you changed course and you started a whole new way of relating to people and teaching people. That's brought a lot of meaning to your life. And actually, as you were sharing that story, I was thinking about a neighbor of mine who came over to talk to me. She was really struggling, and she was worrying a lot about her own son, she felt depressed and who hadn't thrived during distance learning in the spring. And she was really concerned about what that might look like going forward. And he's only 10. And I shared with her that same idea about the main character being the hero. And she thought for a moment, and she said, when my son was 6, I had this terrible thing happen. One minute he was fine, and the next he wasn't breathing, and he was having an anaphylactic reaction to a food product, and we had to rush him to the hospital. He spent a week in the ICU. We didn't know if he would make it. It was the absolute worst period of my life. It was terrifying. But since then, I've raised hundreds of thousands of dollars for food allergy research.
Wow.
And that was her hero that emerged because of that villain, the villain being the food allergy. And I don't know what will happen post-pandemic, but I imagine there are a lot of heroes that are being formed right now because people are responding to needs or being inspired to do things that they might not otherwise have done because of this difficult time.
I love that idea. It's making me think of, I kind of want to bring the conversation around a little bit to, like, what can parents of young children, what can parents of any children really, if there's one thing this pandemic has taught me, it's that there's so much similarity between, older kids and younger kids. It kind of doesn't matter. And what matters is us, right? Or at least partly. So I got to interview a woman that I used to work really closely with. We were like colleagues that we taught in the same room for several years. So she was in charge of the special needs kids, and I was in charge of the typical kids. And we just had this great bond. Her name's Trisha Tommaso. She's on the show pretty frequently. And during the pandemic, she was sharing that that this is a group of people for whom distance learning is a real challenge, like 3, 4-year-old children there. She was really worrying about the kids in her class and the kids at this age. And one of the things that she shared that was really great was trying to give them the sense of, at least, we're still together in this sense, basically, like we're still connecting. And she says that really hit home for her one day. She was doing a meeting, and she was doing a Zoom call where the kids would sit and have a circle time with her, and she would read and they would talk and sing a song and stuff like that. And she had something else planned. And basically what happened was one of the kids leaned in and said, "Miss Tomaso," leans way into the camera and says, "I hate the coronavirus."
Oh,
And she said, "Me too." It sort of gave her the chance to sort of bond with him, right? And then all the other kids are chiming in, "Me too, I hate it too." And like, "I can't do this, and I have to wear a mask," and all the kinds of frustrations that they all have. And it was just such a I think it was such a moment for her of like, this is what's possible. We can help our kids share. We can help them feel, even though we're separated, we're still together, kind of a thing. And I'd love your thoughts on how parents can, I think, foster that within their own relationship with their kids. But any thoughts on helping with other people besides themselves, people outside of the home?
how parents can help kids outside the home?
Yeah, how they can help. Because as we've been talking about, it's not like we're going to be able to sit them down and say, "Here's my advice to you for your, for this school year, darling." But how else can we be helping them, even if we can't give them advice, quote unquote?
I think when we're dealing with kids, one of the things that we want to be doing is validating how they feel, just like that teacher did. She was ready to stop everything for this emotional moment. And that's so critical, because when kids are firing from their amygdala, when they're scared, when they're upset, they are not able to learn anyway. That's true if you're 4, and that's true if you're 14, and it's true if you're 44. It doesn't really matter.
Yep.
And so in this time in particular, we want to make sure that we're pausing to acknowledge how kids feel. I think sometimes as parents, even as educators, we might want to dismiss how they're feeling in a bid to make them feel better. Like, it's not that big of a deal. This is not going to last that long. Or, people have been through much worse and you can handle it. And just to dismiss it. But validating doesn't mean that you agree or think that they should wallow in it forever. But it does make it possible for them to get beyond the point where they're just stuck in that paralyzed or overwhelmed place, to get to a point where they can problem solve a little bit.
Yep.
So it might be, so validating would be, I get it. I would be pretty bummed out too if I thought everybody was having a Google Hangout without me. Or I would be upset too if I was looking forward to Little League and they canceled baseball and it doesn't seem to make any sense.
Yeah.
So let's talk about what we can do to make you feel better. What might help? And that's really what we want to be teaching children. If they're older, you can use the language of proactive, reactive, passive. If you are proactive, you're maybe calling a friend who makes you feel better. If you're passive, you're just sitting around thinking, gosh, life is going to really suck forever. If you're reactive, maybe you're angry or crying and just yelling and not being constructive in any way, shape, or form. And for kids to feel that sense of agency, for them to feel that optimism and that sense of hope, we need to be giving them back some ownership and some control. That's why play is so important. You talked earlier about how kids are getting into more mischief, and the upside of that is that means they're playing more. And when kids can play, they feel more of a greater sense of control over their destiny.
Yeah.
So I think really just helping kids drill down to what it is that they're feeling, why they're feeling that way. And let's talk about what we can do to feel better. We can even share things we do to feel better. When I'm feeling like that, here's what I try. Or just tell them, I'm feeling pretty bad. Do you have any ideas for me? Kids love to help other people feel better, but we want them to really be thinking in terms of coping strategies. This is such a great time to develop coping strategies. And I feel like it's a time when we're really normalizing mental illness in a way that we haven't done appropriately in the past, because I know the Gallup poll recently showed that during the pandemic, 1 in 3 adults are reporting that they have symptoms of anxiety or depression. I think this is something that people are embracing as a real problem and really thinking about how they can feel better in ways that maybe they wouldn't if they're so distracted by overscheduled lives and going from here to there.
It is about validating that experience. I mean, that's true for us, just like it's true for our kids. That's
yes.
So cool. In the Parenting in Place Masterclass, I wanted to bring this up before, and I get to now. So you had shared among so much else about how talking with the teachers about appropriate expectations is something that that parents can be doing, and I would love if you could kind of enlarge on that a little bit.
That also ties into the whole concept of desirable difficulty. We want to be getting kids enough outside of their comfort zone that they have to stretch and learn something new, but we don't want to be pushing them so far that we're setting them up for failure. And I think now more than ever, it's really important that kids feel competent and that they feel successful. Feeling successful doesn't mean we give them all an A. That doesn't make them feel successful if they haven't earned it. It makes them feel the opposite. But it does mean that we're meeting them where they are, particularly now when there are probably gaps in instruction, and some kids might not have been able to attend as many classes as other kids, or may not have even attended any classes. And teachers might be helping catch some kids up while other kids just took a deep dive and really pursued their passion projects during that time period, and maybe they're bored because they've moved so far ahead. And I think that's one of the challenges, that differentiation piece is going to be so challenging for teachers right now, especially in the absence of face-to-face instruction. And we need to be partnering with the schools. That's something where parents can really communicate to the school or to the teacher, here's where my kid is. Here's where they're frustrated. I never want a parent fighting about homework with their kid or fighting about whether or not they're attending a Zoom class. Home should be that safe place where that relationship should not be destroyed by whatever is happening in the classroom. If that's the case, parents should reach out to the school and say, here's what I'm noticing. Here's what I've observed. Could you talk to my child? Could you help them problem solve? Or could you check in with them and make sure they understand what the expectations are if they're disorganized? But taking yourself out of that adversarial position and handing that part over to the school is going to be critical, particularly now.
And that means that you can be on your child's team. You're not the one standing there trying to make them do all these things that they don't want to do. You can be saying, like, let's figure out how to make this work for you. I'm here with you and for you, right?
Absolutely. And there could be ways to make the work more relevant or more enjoyable for a child that have nothing to do with difficulty. It could be that they're not that into math, but they're really into baseball statistics. And a teacher can maybe tailor a project to comport to whatever that child's passions are. And so there are a lot of things that schools can do creatively to help keep kids engaged even during remote learning.
Yeah. Yeah. One of the previous Parenting in Place Masterclass guests was the two gentlemen who wrote The Self-Driven Child, and I'm not remembering
Ned Johnson and Bill Stixrud.
Yeah, so this was Bill. He said, I want you to learn these words and I want you to practice them. This is not working for my child. How can we work together to make something that works? And I was like, I love that so much.
Yeah, that was great advice. When kids are in school and you're trying to figure out if your child has a learning difference or if they're struggling, you're almost like an anthropologist and you're collecting information from their teachers, from their coaches, from their art teacher. You're trying to see if they are behaving differently in different contexts. Even their friends' parents might have some observations that are helpful. Right now, the burden is really on parents to pay attention at home because they don't have the benefit of so many different adults interacting with their children daily, but it's also an opportunity to really see how your child learns and to see what trips them up and to see what they need in order to be successful. Some kids might need to be right next to you at the kitchen table. Some might be fine up in their room working completely independently. But I think that is, again, one of the silver linings, that it's an opportunity to help set your child up for success by observing what's getting in their way. If they're socially having issues because you can see that they're making funny faces on the Zoom during class and they're annoying their peers, you can, without shaming them, say, I noticed that it looked like kids were a little frustrated when you were making a lot of faces. What do you think you might want to change things up a little bit to get a different reaction from them.
Yeah. Yeah.
But there's so many ways we can give and assist right now.
Yeah. I love that. So, one of the parents I work closely with was recently asking the question, like, I, I'm upset because a professional has told me that my child's problems are, quote, behavioral. And, she's got these documented disorders. She's got these huge problems. And I remember saying, like, what's really good about this is, I want you to shift your thinking a little bit because it is behavioral, and that means it can be changed. Like, this is a good thing.
Yeah, that's communication.
Yeah, exactly, exactly. And so to try and help, this little girl sort of be able to think on reflectively, just as you were saying, Phyllis, like, what could I be doing differently, and how is what I am doing now putting other people off? If I'm yelling at another child who wants to play with me, they probably won't want to play with me again.
Yeah, and we can give them really concrete tips. We can say things like, what if you were to go into the Zoom room and wait a full 5 minutes? You can even time it before you talk. And then the challenge is that you ask a question directly related to something that they were talking about. So we can give them some really practical, concrete strategies right now. We probably wouldn't even see those interactions if we were not watching them from home.
Yeah. Yeah. So it's really it is definitely an opportunity. I mean, amidst all the strife and worries here, we do have a great opportunity to be with our kids more, to engage with them more, to get to know them better.
Yep.
Cool. Well, I don't even want to wrap this conversation up because it's such a good time, but our time is pretty much finished. So I am going to say thank you so much to Phyllis Fagell. Thank you so much for coming on our show today. It's really been a pleasure to have you on.
It's been great talking to you too. Thank you.
Yeah. Yeah. You can find Phyllis at her website, which is phyllisfagell.com. And the links for everything we talk about today are in the show notes, so you don't have to worry about spelling or whatever. And you should also go there to feel better about when your child hits those middle school years. And you should read Middle School Matters, which I have not read it yet, but boy, I'm excited to. It looks like an outstanding book. You can find me at WeTurnedOutOK.com, where I've got lots of resources for parents. One that I've just recently come out with is called the We Turned Out Okay Playbook. It is a non-digital thing. It's a thing that arrives in your U.S. mailbox, and you can sit with with it at your favorite chair, and it can help you all through the month, sort of, because the monthly publication, to be able to think critically and clearly and with a little bit of fun and whimsy about, like, what are we doing right now? What are our lives like? And I'm very, very excited because this is something that's been working its way out of me for like months. And the pandemic seemed like the perfect time to be able to, offer it. So that's one of the things that you can find over there. And finally, I have got a huge thanks to our producer, the man whose voice you hear at the top of this show. He makes the show sound great. And he is the 23-time winner of the Husband of the Year Award. That's Benjamin Culp. Again, thank you so much for listening, and we will see you next time.